Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the EkaShri Schools of Yoga podcast. So as we've been doing the past couple of episodes, we've been recording a set of discussion topics where Shriram and I have a conversation around specific topics and try to really understand what these topics mean from a meaning standpoint, as well as how these various different topics within yoga philosophy are applicable to daily lives. And so, like we've said in the past, the goal of the podcast is to find the real world applications of these various different topics in order to then understand how we can think about applying them practically and also have some context about them when we hear these words or these concepts come up next. So as always, if you do have any topics or subjects you would like to suggest or have us discuss, feel free to let us know at info@ekashri.yoga, and we'd be happy to accommodate over the next couple of sessions as part of the podcast. So today's topic is something that I think is going to be interesting for a lot of our listeners, especially myself included, because we're going to be talking about the Sun Salutation practice, or Surya Namaskaras. And I'm sure a lot of you have, either heard the term before, or have either practiced Surya Namaskaras before during any kind of yoga class. And so today we wanted to give a little bit more background as to what this concept actually means and why the concept of Surya Namaskaras are important within yoga practice and yoga philosophy more broadly. So Shriramji, thanks for being here once again. So why don't we go ahead and start with the term Surya Namaskar? What does the word actually mean?
Thank you, Vedantji. Namaste. So Surya Namaskar, as you rightly pointed out, is perhaps a ubiquitous practice. Although there are several yoga traditions and several schools of yoga, several styles of yoga, perhaps one of the common threads that we find is the practice of the Surya Namaskar or the Sun Salutation. So when we look at the words Surya Namaskara, so the literal translation would be a salutation to the sun. So it's a practice where we express our gratitude, our appreciation to the sun, and it can be interpreted in many ways. One of the interpretation could be that because the presence of the sun spurs activity on this planet. So in the traditional teachings of yoga and Vedanta, we seek to see the divinity in everything. Like we talked about in the previous couple of sessions on Namaste, to see the divinity in the other. So one of the practice is to see the divinity even in nature, to see the divine in the rivers, in the mountains, in the sky, in the earth, and in the sun. And recognizing that it is the presence of the sun that spurs all the activity on this planet. And it is crucial for the existence and the sustenance of life on this planet, the source of energy that spurs all the activities on this planet. So for that we are grateful. So that is one aspect of Sun Salutation. The other aspect is, in the teachings of yoga, sun has been used as a metaphor. And even when we talk in colloquial terms, we use adjectives that represent light to talk about someone who's very successful. For example, we say this person is brilliant. That means a brilliant mind. So we use adjectives of light to recognize excellence in them. So sun, as we use as a metaphor, we can think of it as the core aspect of our existence from which all the energy, all the exuberance comes forth. So ultimately, we can think of the Sun Salutation as the process of getting in touch with the divine space within ourself, which we can call as the Surya Tattva, or the essence within us, which is so bright, so luminous, and which is metaphorically, we can think of it as the sun within us. So these are all the dimensions of the Sun Salutation.
Wonderful. That's a really interesting explanation. And so thanks for sharing that very nuanced perspective around the Surya Namaskar sequence. So maybe before we get into what the sequence actually entails, can we talk a little bit about the history of the practice and how did this whole practice of these Sun Salutations come about?
So when we look at the phrase Surya Namaskara, the actual phrase can be traced back all the way to the Vedas, so several thousands of years back. And there are specific sections in the Rig Veda that talks about Surya Namaskara mantras. And the whole chant of these mantras takes about an hour or 2 hours to chant them out. So these are all uh, chants that we find in the ancient texts and which are still alive today. They are chanted in many centers in India, even today. And so those are the origins of the word sun salutation. So it is more of chanting and introspection and meditation. But the practice of sun salutation, as we come to understand it today, for example, when we say Surya Namaskar or sun salutation, most people immediately associate that with the sequence of postures, perhaps 12 step sequence or a 10-step sequence, depending on the version of the Surya Namaskar. So that specific form of the sun salutation, the physical aspect of it, is quite recent actually, and many may find it surprising that this expression of sun salutation, the sequence of about a dozen postures, is a little less than 100 years old, and different uh, legendary yogis have been attributed as the creator of this sequence, and one of them is the legendary yogi Sri Krishnamacharya, who is credited to have put together um, and sequenced several vinyasas. Vinyasas are specially crafted sequence of postures, and the Surya Namaskar is one such vinyasa, which is called Vishesha Vinyasa. That means special construction or special combination of postures. And there are many, including Surya Namaskar. There are many other Vishesha Vinyasas as well, and Surya Namaskar is one of them. So it is less than about 100 years old, and many people give the dates as about 1928 or 1930. During that time frame is when the modern form of the sun salutation emerged.
Wonderful. So that's a lot of, I think, important history and context behind the practice. So thanks for sharing that. And I think that helps set the stage next time when people, come to the top of their mats and think about starting the practice. I think all these points so far have given us a lot of a sense of what to expect when we're thinking about the practice, and also a lot of positioning, right? So I think when we think about coming to the top of our mats, like we just mentioned, and starting the practice, there's sort of this, reflection, there's sort of this connection that you make with the sun. And I think it's just important when our audience knows, how to think about this practice as they then go start to do it in physical practice. So thanks for sharing those points there. So why don't we now talk about, now that we've given some historical context, why don't we delve into the role specifically a little bit more about the sun in this practice? And specifically, Shriramji, why do we start with the namaste position in the starting position when we begin the practice? So I think we've acknowledged that this is sort of an acknowledgement of the sun, but can we delve a little bit deeper into this relationship and how this sort of manifests within the practice itself?
Yes, usually the first posture in the sequence, regardless of which version of the sun salutation we practice, is the Namaskara Mudra, where we stand usually with the feet together, the Tadasana and the mountain posture, also called Samasthiti in some practices in yoga, in some schools. Samasthiti literally means the state of equilibrium, where we balance the weight of the body equally on both feet and keeping the feet together, and we join the palms together, keeping the hands close to the heart center. And that becomes the first posture in the sequence. And as we discussed before, this is also a gesture that we adopt when we say namaste to somebody. And when we join the palms together and bring the hands close to the heart center, so we're actually activating the heart center, the Anahata chakra. And that is the chakra where a connection is made, connection with other people and connection with other entities, with nature and so forth. And also, there is another significance to it as well. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali makes a very interesting observation about the chitta. Chitta is translated as the mind. He says the root of the mind is actually residing in the heart center. Usually, when we think of the mind, we think of the head region. Thoughts are moving around in the head, which is true. That's where we feel intuitively we feel that the thoughts are in the head region, but the mind is actually rooted in the heart. So there's a sutra where he says, Hridaye Chitta Samvit. Hridaya, the heart center, is the chitta. It comes from there, it's rooted there, and its expressions you will find as thoughts in the head and so forth. So when we join the palms together and bring the hands close to the heart center, what we are doing is we are allowing the mind to repose with the self. We are allowing the mind to turn back and settle down rather than being active with thoughts and extroverted. We are allowing the mind to repose, to relax, to settle down so that we begin the practice of the sun salutation from a centered place, not with an agitated or a distracted place. So we allow the mind to go back to its root, which resides in the heart center.
Wonderful. I think that's a very interesting explanation. And I really like that connection you made between the heart and the practice. And I think that's a very important point, sort of a very nuanced description of the practice, right? And how we think about it, because I would never have thought that the heart has a role to play here in this practice. So that's a very interesting connection. So why don't we, now that we've talked about, what sort of a little bit more context about the practice, sort of why it's important and what we hope to achieve from the practice, I think I'd like to spend a little bit of time in this discussion, just given how practical the Surya Namaskar sequence is, just talking a little bit more about the sequence itself, as well as what are some of the benefits, so that our listeners can try to think about these benefits as they go ahead and practice this set of postures next. So first, Shriramji, why don't we talk about what are the specific sequences or postures within the Surya Namaskar sequence, and how did it end up, all of these different practices being picked together in this one sequence, and why these practices over maybe not some others?
Yes. So the actual specific steps, perhaps we will address that in one of the future sessions in a practical way, where we will demonstrate the sequence. And so regardless of which style of yoga or which system of yoga, because there are several versions of the sun salutation, there are some common themes. One of the common aspect across the different versions of the sun salutation is that each round of the sun salutation is a complete holistic sequence. It's a well-rounded sequence of postures that has all-round benefit for the whole body. It exercises all the major muscles of the body, all the major joints of the body. It complements strengthening and stretching or relaxing variations of the postures. It also exercises the spine in all its modes of movement, like bending forwards, arching back, and so forth. Extension of the spine, lengthening the spine by raising the arms up. And so in this sense, it's a holistic exercise for the body. It also attends to the internal organs, especially when we bend forwards because of the compression that you feel in the abdominal cavity. So all the vital organs of the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity. So both of these sets of organs are also exercised, and they're massaged, and the brisk flow of prana is made to move across all these internal organs. So going beyond the physical level, we also have at the pranic level. So we can think of it as the pranamaya kosha, which is the realm of all the physiological processes. We allow for a more brisk movement of prana. So when the prana, the life energy, is moving very sluggish, we feel dull and lethargic. We feel as if we don't have the energy to do things. Whereas when the prana is moving brisk in the body, then there is more vitality in the system. We are quick to do things that need to be done. There is no laziness. There is no there is nothing in us that resists activity. So we are quick to move. There's a lot of energy within us. There is a lot of vibrancy in the system. And my teacher also used to give a very interesting analogy. When the prana is made to move brisk in the body, and to move the prana brisk, sun salutation is an excellent practice, right? Because the emphasis is on movement, controlled movements, and in turn, it moves the prana more brisk in the system. He used to give the analogy of riding a bicycle. When you are moving, you are able to balance better on the bicycle, right? Whereas when you are stationary, you just keep wobbling. You don't balance when you're on a bicycle. In like manner, when the prana in the system is moving very brisk, then there is more balance, samatvam in the body and in the mind. We are able to physically balance. When we do the balancing postures, it's easier to stay there in a very stable manner rather than keep wobbling. And also, there is mental stability as well. So that's in the realm of the prana. Prana is made to move more brisk in the system. And at the level of the mind, there is more clarity, because when we talk about the luminous attribute of the sun, how brilliant it is, it's so bright. So when we bring the same attribute to the level of the mind and the intellect, so the mind gets transformed from a place of uh, clog, where there is mental fog and we are not able to see things clearly, and we replace that, we transform that state of mind to a place of clarity. So that is at the level of the mind. And at the level of the emotions, because this is a way to express gratitude and appreciation to the sun, the emotions are purified. In other words, if the mind is caught up in negative thoughts, then by doing the practice of sun salutation, we replace negative thoughts with thoughts of gratitude and with thoughts of devotion. So we transform at the emotional level as well. And finally, this is a spiritual practice. So by becoming aware of the sacredness that lies behind this practice, this is a way to honor the sun with devotion. So we elevate the practice from a mere physical activity to that of a spiritual discipline. So you can think of it as a prayer. We're uplifting the quality of this activity to that of a spiritual discipline. So the specific sequence of the postures, to come back to your question, is that it balances energy and relaxation. It balances and it attends to all parts of the body, all the major muscles, all the major joints of the body, and it's a well-rounded sequence that benefits the entire system. And one of the things my teacher used to say is practice yoga every day, but if you don't have time to practice your entire set, for example, if the practice that you do every day is say 45 minutes or perhaps an hour, but on some day when we are very busy and we have only say 5 minutes to devote to our practice, then he would suggest do a couple of rounds of Surya Namaskar. That's it. It's a well-rounded sequence of practice, and it benefits the whole body, and it benefits the breath, benefits the mind, benefits all levels of our existence. So in that sense, the Surya Namaskar practice is very special. It's a short capsule that gives all-round benefits to the whole system.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And so from what I understand, you're saying, Shriramji, so basically these set of practices have been designed to give a very holistic sort of, not maybe stretch is not the best word, but a holistic sort of activity to the whole body. You get the full complement of movements, the whole spectrum, forward bends, backward bends, you get the horizontal movement, etc. And so that makes a lot of sense. So I guess maybe one question then, Shriramji, you mentioned about how this is, a very holistic practice. It gives a lot of benefits, both physically as well as otherwise. So maybe the next question to ask logically here is that, is there a right way to practice these Surya Namaskaras? So for example, you mentioned that, okay, you can get a good stretch about it. So should it be practiced extremely fast, or should it be done more as a slower, as a flow sort of practice? Or are there different situations where you might do one or the other specifically? So I guess, what is the right way to think about practicing this in order to get the maximum benefit? And can you maybe think about practicing it different ways in order to get other specific benefits if you don't want the whole holistic thing for that situation?
You are right. There are different variations that we can do with the Surya Namaskar. And my teacher used to emphasize that we need to tailor make the practice to suit where we are. We are not trying to adapt the body to do imagined correct way to do the sun salutation. We need to bring the practice to adopt to the body. If the body is not prepared to do the posture, for example, a couple of postures may be very challenging to begin with, then do not push the body beyond its comfort zone. So we do it gently. Perhaps after several weeks of practice, the body is ready to go to the next step. Or perhaps the body is, it requires a lot of modifications in the sun salutation. There are different versions that we can do. For example, there's a version that can be done on a chair sun salutation, and I've seen it benefit so many uh, elders and seniors who may not be able to do the classic version of the sun salutation. So it can be modified. Now, regarding the pace at which we do the sun salutation, we have several options there. So when we do it fast, of course, it can serve as a good warm up. It can serve as a good energizer. My teacher always used to emphasize the doing the practice slowly, because it becomes meditation in movement, or we can say meditation in motion. So we do it slowly so that we don't get tempted to use jerky movements. When we do the sun salutations fast, that could be a temptation to do the flow with a lot of jerkiness, not in a very controlled manner. So my teacher used to emphasize doing it slowly. And in my own experience, I have noticed that doing the practice slowly actually has more benefits. I feel more intense in intensity of the practice as well as in the benefits. Now, having said that, one of the things my teacher also used to advise is, depending on the specific body type. For example, in Ayurveda, they talk about the body type being Vata, Pitta, or Kapha, or combinations of these three doshas. So, depending on the body type, tailor make or personalize the practice of Surya Namaskar, how you do the Surya Namaskar based on your unique body type. To give an example, a Kapha body type. So, who is a Kapha body type? Perhaps uh, they move slowly, or perhaps they are good in activities that require um, stability in the mind and in the body. In other words, sitting in one place and thinking, uh, perhaps there is no deadline. They have the luxury of time to think about something. So they excel in such situations. Whereas things or activities that demand quick actions, in order to bring that aspect of it, to complement that aspect of it, it is a good idea for them to do the sun salutations in a more brisk manner. Whereas for a Vata body type, their mind is usually restless. When there is too much Vata, there is a lot of restlessness. So they benefit by doing the sun salutation more slowly, you see, slowly and meditatively. And for Pitta body type, same thing, do it more slowly. And the difference between the recommendation for Vata and Pitta is that for Pitta body type, Pitta literally means like acid or fire. Pitta is like fire. So they have intense emotions. And Pitta people, when they do yoga, they may bring a very competitive element, or doing the practice with ruthless determination. Oh, I want to achieve perfection on day one. You see? So for them, it is recommended to do the sun salutation slowly, and also not push the body too much. Emphasize more on the relaxing aspect of it. You see? Whereas for Vata body type, doing the postures slowly in the sun salutation, but emphasize the stability aspect, emphasize the strength aspect of it. So these are some variations, subtle differences, how the different body types can benefit with the same sun salutation practice by keeping the focus in different areas. Should I do it fast? Should I do it slow? Should I emphasize the relaxing aspect of it? Should I emphasize the strengthening aspect of it and make the practice more intense? So all these depends on the body type, the condition of the body.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. So I think, what I'm hearing is that, there's no, obviously at the highest of levels, right? This is a very comprehensive practice. It provides a ton of holistic benefits. but you can also think about customizing the practice to a certain extent to suit the circumstances or the need that you're trying to get out of this particular practice, right? So to a certain extent, there is no one correct way to practice it, but rather there's a way to practice it in a way where you can get differential benefits. But if you were to do it as we normally practice, just generally, you can kind of get the holistic benefits regardless. So I think that's a very interesting point to note in the practice. And so thanks for all the context around that. And so I think, we've touched upon this a little bit, Shriramji, in terms of the various benefits of practices, physical, anatomical, physiological, and mental. But maybe can we just spend a little bit more time, maybe talking a little bit, I think the physical, everyone sort of understands how that works. Anatomically, that's kind of linked hand in hand. And so I think people understand on the physical and anatomical level why the practice is important. But maybe can we touch a little bit more on the spiritual as well as the mental and relaxation and potentially stress aspect of the Surya Namaskar practice and how that can potentially be helped with the practice? And so what guidance would you have there?
Yes, in fact, let me share from my own personal experience. The very first practice in yoga that I started with was Sun Salutation. I still remember I was 11 years old. So when I approached my teacher, so when I went to the yoga school, I saw students practicing Sun Salutation, practice of Surya Namaskar. And what I observed was that there was movement between postures as well as there was chanting. So this is actually a very integral part of Surya Namaskar, the Sun Salutation. And in the traditional way it is done, each of the 12 postures are associated with one mantra. So this is how I learned the Surya Namaskars. So when we do one posture of the Sun Salutation, you chant the associated mantra. And then when you move on to the next posture, you chant the next mantra. So there are 12 mantras that go with each of the 12 postures in the Sun Salutation. Now, this emphasizes the spiritual aspect of it. When we chant the mantras out loud, so it has benefits across various dimensions. First of all, spiritual benefits, because each of these mantras is a way to honor the sun. For example, one of the mantras is Om Ravaye Namaha. Ravi means the radiant one. So we appreciate that attribute of the sun, which is radiant. And then Suryaya Namaha. Suryaya Namaha means that which promotes vitality in other beings, or that which shares vitality. Mitraya Namaha is the very first mantra. Om Mitraya Namaha. The sun as a friend, relating to the sun as a friend. And so forth. Each of these 12 mantras reveals a different facet of the sun, and we connect with it, and we are grateful for it. So this brings a very spiritual dimension, and you can actually experience it firsthand when you do the Sun Salutation with and without the mantras. And when you chant with the mantras at the end of the round, the mind is so tranquil, because the sound by chanting these mantras creates a space of silence at the end. And that's a very powerful experience. It's a very profound experience, and it has to be experienced rather than just spoken about, because you will feel it when we chant the 12 mantras, and at the end of it, the mind is so tranquil. So in the level of the spiritual dimension, you can see how the mantras elevate the quality of the practice. But the mantras also have other benefits as well. For example, in some of the postures, it is very difficult to chant out loud, because perhaps the breathing is struggling or effortful. And this is especially true in some of the back bending postures of the Sun Salutation. For example, the second posture, where after we do the Namaskara, the second posture, we take the arms up and arch back in the Ardha Chakrasana, also called the Uttana Hastasana. So in this posture, when we arch back, perhaps there is a little choking sensation in the throat, and the breathing is a little more effortful. So when we try to chant the mantra Om Ravaye Namaha in this posture, it becomes a little difficult. So my teacher used to emphasize that when you are able to loudly and effortlessly chant these mantras even in these postures, even in these arching back postures. That means we have attained significant control over our breath, and we have also significantly controlled our voice box. It's a way to exercise our voice. And in fact, many musicians, they practice sun salutations with these mantras as a practice of voice culture. And my teacher himself was a professional musician. He was a great singer, and he used to practice the sun salutation with the mantras, chanting out loud. And even if you sit with eyes closed, listening to the chant, it is so melodious. It brings the mind to a state of meditation. Just as a observer, as a spectator, we it transports us to a state of deep meditation. And he did many creative things with the chant of the sun salutation mantras. One of them being that each mantra he used to sing that in different musical notes by selecting different ragas, the different musical scales in the Indian classical system of music. And the whole thing sounds so melodious. So all these dimensions, they bring about the spiritual dimension, spiritual aspect of it, and the breath control, the voice control, and it also helps us to keep track of which round we are in. After doing the sun salutation for 6 or 8 rounds, sometimes we forget, oh, am I in the sixth round or the eighth round or the ninth round? You see? So he actually developed a system where if you use the specific sequence of musical notes, you will never lose track of which round you are in. And used all this mathematical the combinations and permutations of the notes, so that by the time you finished one whole alankara, it is called, one whole pattern of swaras, you automatically complete 12 rounds of sun salutation. So these are all the many dimensions. He used the intellect, the logical way to construct this practice. So these are all very fascinating aspects that I learned from him.
Yeah, no, and I think that gives hopefully the audience a sense of why, when we at the beginning of the practice, you kind of pair the voice, right? So all these chants with the actual practice of the Surya Namaskar sequence, because that makes a lot of sense, right? And so, like you mentioned, Shriramji, that ability to basically calm down the mind and create this very steady mind while you're doing the practice, I think is incredibly important, because not only do you want that from a perspective of being able to practice the practice correctly, but also from the mental benefit side, right? I mean, if you're doing the practice and then your mind is wandering all over the place with other things, and you have a lot of different things on your mind, you aren't necessarily getting the full justice done to the practice, and rather you have these distracting thoughts, which is going to detract from your ability to actually benefit fully from the practice. So I think it's definitely interesting that, and we've seen this concept of sound throughout, the course of everything we do in yoga philosophy. And so I think it's, all the more important that our audience realizes that it's just important to have the sound aspect and these chants done properly, so that you can then get the benefits both within the practice and beyond. So I think that's an incredible explanation for how we think about the mental and stress as well as other physiological benefits for the practice. So I think a really great way to kind of summarize that. So thanks again for that, Shriramji. So why don't we turn, in the last couple of minutes that we have now, why don't we turn to a little bit more of the practical application of the Surya Namaskar sequence. And I think a couple of things to think about here that we'd like to maybe discuss are, how just broadly should our people, our audience, or whoever is interested in practicing sun salutations, how should they think about practicing, the sequence of postures within? That's the first thing. When should the practice of sun salutations be practiced? And when we think about the practice, how many rounds do we typically do of the practice? Is there any set count that we should think about targeting, or how should we just think about broadly incorporating this practically into our yoga practice during the day?
Yes, usually the sun salutation is practiced in the beginning of our yoga sadhana. For example, if you are practicing the asanas, pranayama, and meditation every day for about an hour, that's the time that we invest in the practice of yoga. Perhaps sun salutation will appear in the beginning. Perhaps after a few loosening practices, maybe in the 5th minute mark, we begin the sun salutation. And my teacher used to recommend that we build enough stamina to do 12 rounds of sun salutation every day. Now, for beginners, he used to suggest do not overdo it. Suppose the body is ready to do only 4 rounds today. Just do 4 rounds. Respect the limitations of the body. And with continued practice, slowly increase the number of rounds from 4 to 6 after a couple of weeks. And then raise the number to 8 rounds after 2 more weeks, and so forth. And slowly build your way up to 12. And 12 is again a ballpark number, depending on the intensity of the practice and depending on which version of the sun salutation. Perhaps even 4 rounds can be fulfilling. 4 rounds might be sufficient. Or if we choose the number 12 and for that specific version of the practice of sun salutation, then we establish that same rhythm. Every day we practice these 12 rounds and it brings the prana flow in a very brisk manner and it prepares us to do the asanas that follow the sun salutation. So after the prana is energized, in other words, it's a nice warm up for the body as well as in the pranamaya kosha, where the prana is moving brisk in the system. When we practice the postures where we hold for long periods of time, it becomes more intense, more beneficial. So when we do the asanas, that after we do the sun salutation. The sun salutation itself, my teacher used to recommend that we do it in the morning and face the sun, that is, face the east direction. And so people used to ask him, if I do the practice in the evening, is it still okay to do the sun salutation? And he used to say yes, because wherever you are, the sun is there. And perhaps when you're doing it in the evening, you face the sun maybe in the west direction and do the practice of sun salutation. But just make sure that in the evening time, if we choose to practice the sun salutation, do not make it too energizing or too vigorous, because so much energy might interfere with the sleep later in the night. Because sun salutation is usually performed in a very energetic manner. So when we do it first thing in the morning, it helps us with a lot of energy that we can utilize during the course of the day. But if you were to do sun salutation at night, make sure to complement that practice with some relaxing practices after that. So emphasize more on stretching and relaxing practices and more on meditation and deep relaxation. Because if we just do sun salutation in the evening, perhaps the mind is so alert that it is very difficult to fall asleep at night. So depending on which time of the day we do, we need to be careful to adjust the practice to derive the full benefits of it. And the sun salutation itself, so as I mentioned before, it is the first thing that I learned from my teacher. And it is still, even today, it is the integral part of my daily practice of yoga. So circling back to the statement that I made in the beginning of the session, this practice is ubiquitous because it is practiced by beginning students of yoga, it is practiced by seasoned yoga practitioners, it is practiced by young and the old, it is practiced across various yoga schools. So this holds a very special, very central place in the practice of yoga today. And it is also interesting to note that it's just a little less than 100 years old, the form of the sun salutation that we practice today.
Wonderful. I think that's very interesting. And so it sounds like you can honestly make the practice of these Surya Namaskaras, right, sort of the cornerstone of a yoga practice as a whole. And so sometimes if you don't have time to practice anything else, or if you're looking for, if people, who often ask, what if I only have like 15 minutes or 20 minutes to practice during the day, what's the number one thing you would recommend that I do? It sounds like this might be an obvious candidate or an obvious answer to potentially put forth, because it touches upon all these different aspects of yoga practice, right? You've got the physical aspects because you've got all the asanas within. You've got a little bit of the whole loosening component because you're having the body flow from one set of practices to another. And so naturally you get that exercise, you get that dynamism there. You get the benefits of the breathing because we're chanting normally with the practice. You then go ahead and get the mental benefits. So it's a very nice practice. It seems like, Shriramji, I think summing up this discussion where you can kind of really touch upon the various different aspects of what yoga stands for and what the beneficial aspects of yoga are in multiple dimensions. You can kind of see that tangibly through the Surya Namaskar practice itself and kind of get all of these different benefits on multiple dimensions just through this practice alone. So I hope that, reflects well with our audience, and I hope next time they think about doing the practice, they understand this, because I think that's such an important point that you mentioned. And, for people who just don't have that much time to practice, I think this is probably the best one-stop thing to go forth with. And like you said, you can pair it with something else like meditation or something else like a relaxation, depending on, what time of the day you're practicing. But on the whole, I think this has been an incredibly powerful discussion on the practice of the Surya Namaskar sequence. And I think I definitely have learned a lot in terms of, the benefits of it, as well as going a level deeper into why this practice is so important and how it should be practiced moreover, right? So I think that's been a wonderful discussion, Shriramji. So unless you have any other closing thoughts, I think that this has been a very productive discussion. I think a lot of good stuff for us to think about the next time we're on the mats doing the practice of the Sun Salutations. And hopefully now, for myself as well as for the audience, when we go ahead and practice next, we can be a little bit more intentional about how we think about the practice, right from where we begin with the starting position with our hands folded and acknowledging the sun, all the way down to finishing the actual postures within the practice, and then coming back out and getting the full benefits from the practice as a whole. So thank you again, Shriramji, and I'll leave it to you if you have any other closing thoughts. Otherwise, we can go ahead and maybe conclude for today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vedantji. One last thing I would like to mention is uh, coming back to the number of rounds that we do every day. So on special occasions during the year, where we honor the sun, for example, on the New Year, uh, during the Indian calendar New Year, for example, it's a very special day for all the yogis. So they take the time to practice more than 12 rounds, sometimes 108 rounds. So on special occasions like these, uh, we also dedicate more time for the sun salutation as well. So that is something also that is done in the practice of yoga. So thank you very much, Vedantji. That was a very nice discussion. And in one of the future sessions, we will definitely go into the practical aspect of it with the proper demo of each posture in the sun salutation sequence, and also consider a couple of variations as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shriramji, once again for this really nice explanation all around on the whole Surya Namaskar sequence and the Sun Salutation practice. I think, definitely next time I go on the mat, I think I have a lot more context with which to go into the practice of the Sun Salutations with. So definitely hope our audience has been able to gather that level of information as well, and really think about the next time they're doing this practice, sort of not only why they're doing it, but they also know what are the key points to think about and look for when they're doing the practice of the Sun Salutations. So thank you very much, Shriramji. And I think for that, we'll go ahead and conclude for today, and we will see our listeners once again for the next podcast episode coming up shortly soon after.
Thank you very much.
Namaste.
Namaste.